Dr. Matthew Young is a senior research and policy analyst at the Canadian Centre on Substance Abuse and an adjunct research professor of psychology at Carleton University in Ottawa. Dr. Young leads CCSA's drug use epidemiology research activities, which include the Canadian Community Epidemiology Network on Drug Use, the Student Drug Use Surveys Working Group, as well as CCSA's work on novel psychoactive substances. Matthew's doctoral work was in describing and measuring gambling-related craving among problem gamblers. He also co-chairs the Low-Risk Gambling Guidelines Scientific Working Group, along with Dr. David Hodgins. Gambling is a legal behaviour that poses potential risk to Canadians. Problem gambling has been recognized as a significant public health issue, yet there is a lack of evidence-informed guidelines to provide individuals who gamble with recommendations about how to gamble in a manner that poses minimal risk to themselves and those around them. There is an important need for such guidelines to help prevent gambling problems and reduce harms among Canadians. It is against this background that the Canadian Centre on Substance Abuse accepted the mandate to lead a project aimed at developing Canada's first national low-risk gambling guidelines by March 2020. Funded by Mise à Trois, an organization responsible for promoting responsible gambling, these new guidelines will help Canadians make informed and responsible decisions about their gambling behaviour in general and in specific situations or circumstances that are particularly risky, such as in the context of alcohol use and drug consumption. This presentation will provide an overview of the project and the proposed plan of action for developing the low-risk gambling guidelines. This presentation outlines a project that has recently been funded to develop national low-risk gambling guidelines. Firstly, I would like to define some terminology. In the context of this presentation, low risk refers to being at a low risk of experiencing harms from gambling, rather than referring to low-risk gamblers, according to an assessment instrument such as the PGSI. The context of this presentation and the development of low-risk gambling guidelines is the question of whether we can develop guidelines that will allow people to make informed decisions so that they can lower the risk of experiencing harms from gambling. Now that we have some context and terminology, let's move forward. To begin, I'm going to tell you a little bit about CCSA, the Canadian Centre of Substance Abuse. The CCSA was created by an Act of Parliament just over 25 years ago to provide arm's-length, evidence-based information to the government to support informed decision-making. The CCSA has worked in many areas, including gambling. The CCSA's mission is to address issues of substance abuse in Canada and to reduce the harms associated with these substances. These are the different areas the CCSA works in. We are the only organization with a national mandate to reduce the harms of gambling and substance use in Canada. We have a demonstrated track record in these areas, and one of the CCSA's previous projects that feeds most closely into the development of low-risk gambling guidelines was the development of Canada's low-risk drinking guidelines, which was produced in 2012. The CCSA collaborates on projects with experts across Canada. The following two slides detail some of the projects that the CCSA has led along with collaborators, one of the largest being the development of the Canadian Problem Gambling Index, CPGI, out of which comes the Problem Gambling Severity Index, PGSI. The PGSI is now used throughout Canada and internationally to assess gambling problems in adults. The need for low-risk gambling guidelines was first championed by Hubert Sacy, chair of the board of the Quebec-based responsible gambling organization, Mise à Trois. Mise à Trois funded this project with the awareness that there would be significant challenges, but recognizing that gambling is a legal and promoted activity that people engage in, which also has harms associated with it. Since it is not possible to completely control the way in which individuals gamble, it is hoped that the development of low-risk gambling guidelines will outline the safe limits to prevent and reduce harms associated with gambling. In the absence of formal national guidelines to minimize the experience of harms, recommendations and messaging for gambling responsibly may be inconsistent from province to province, if they even exist at all. In coming up with the guidelines, we considered two key aspects that we wanted to maximize: long-term stability and how useful they would be for people in the field. One of the core problem gambling prevention or responsible gambling slogans used by Mise à Trois was "not too frequently, not too much, and not too long." We're working to quantify that sentiment, to come up with real concrete numbers that could be attached to it. How often is not too frequently? How much money or time is too much? How many hours or minutes is too long? I'll speak more about the approaches we used, which followed our approach when developing the low-risk drinking guidelines. I will cover this project's governance structure and our general approach in the slides that follow. We began by establishing a framework that included a low-risk gambling advisory committee comprised of people who have worked in the field, such as regulators and prevention workers, as well as including people from a cross-section of different sectors across Canada. We also established a low-risk gambling scientific working group, which is still in the project planning phase, so consists of a smaller group. We will likely work to add additional individuals with experience in different areas to this group as the project moves forward. These two groups will work to develop a research plan and to conduct the research that will inform the eventual guidelines. Finally, we will prepare a technical report aimed at a broad audience, outlining the best available evidence in support of low-risk gambling guidelines. This visualizes the project's governance structure. The advisory committee is chaired by Luis Nadeau from University of Montreal and Rita Nadarandria, CEO of CCSA. This committee's mandate is to guide and facilitate uptake and mobilization of the guidelines and advise as we move along. The scientific working group is co-chaired by David Hodgins and myself. This group will provide expert advice and conduct research. In addition to being co-chaired by David Hodgins and myself, the scientific working group will include Sean Curry from Alberta Health Services and University of Calgary, Luis Nadeau from the University of Montreal, and Catherine Paradis from CCSA. Catherine is one of the authors who developed the low-risk drinking guidelines that we are using as a model to develop the low-risk gambling guidelines. When the CCSA developed the low-risk drinking guidelines, there were certainly challenges, but there were also aspects that made the task easier. For example, the World Health Organization endorsed a causal connection between certain levels of drinking and health outcomes that can be linked to ICD-10 codes in hospitals, types of cancers, cirrhosis, etc. This made it easier to identify and associate a list of recognized harms associated with drinking, and examine consumption patterns to determine where the risk of experiencing those harms increases. From there, it was possible to look at the increases across a large spectrum of harms and to establish guidelines that were at once trying to minimize probability that an individual will experience harms from drinking, but also be easily translatable into public health perspective. This was key and allowed the low-risk drinking guidelines to be implemented into a successful public health campaign. In the case of low-risk gambling guidelines, there is not as much consensus on harms. There are a wide range of types of harms that can be associated with gambling, and this complicates the task of establishing guidelines, more so than in the case of developing low-risk drinking guidelines. To begin developing the guidelines, we first needed to establish just what is meant by low risk in the context of low-risk gambling guidelines. Is it low risk of becoming a problem gambler, or low risk of experiencing harms from gambling? We determined it was the latter. Low risk of experiencing harms from gambling. We came to this determination because the concept of problem gambling is in fact just a hypothetical construct consisting of a cluster of harms. Once we established the need for these guidelines and what is meant by low risk, we needed to determine the specific methodology for developing the low-risk gambling guidelines. This is a broad overview of the methodology we are following. This is an iterative process. If something does not appear to be working, we will adjust and continually assess what is and is not working. I will go through each element in more detail in the next slide. The first step was to build on the definition we just discussed. That is, what does low risk refer to, which we determined to be low risk of experiencing harms from gambling. Now, to identify those harms, in August 2016, we decided to use Erica Langham's Victoria Taxonomy of Gambling Harms, which includes a broad examination and categorization of harms. This further conceptualizes our definition as low risk of experiencing harms as per Erica Langham's Victoria Taxonomy of Gambling Harms. The second step was towards developing the risk curves that will enable us to determine at what level of frequency, duration, and expenditure an individual is more likely to experience harms. To achieve that, we needed to develop data sets. In November 2016, our group worked through a large number of existing datasets nationally and internationally and identified those that we thought were the best candidates for developing the risk curves. Because we are using Erica Langham's taxonomy of harms, we will need to determine how those harms are assessed, since the operationalizations will vary across many datasets. It is likely there will be significant heterogeneity in the outputs, which we could work through and try to understand. The third step will be to assess the feasibility of using the identified datasets to calculate the risk curves. The parameters to conduct this feasibility assessment were developed by Sean Curry, part of the scientific working group. At this point, we will begin to contract the data holders to conduct the feasibility assessment on their datasets. The fourth step will consist of conducting targeted analyses on the approved data and building the risk curves. We envisioned developing a table that will allow us to identify a sweet spot where the relative increase of experiencing a harm will be maximized at a science-based level, but will also be reasonable from a public health perspective. For example, if the data analyses show the maximum duration before harm is 2 seconds of gambling per year, that will not be a realistic guideline to implement. There will need to be a balance between what the data identifies and how easily it can be taken up in a public health campaign. It is important to identify explicit outcomes for a project of this kind. In our case, we hope to ultimately reduce harms associated with gambling. Overall, we want to provide individuals with the tools to keep their gambling activities within safe limits, the same way there are low-risk drinking guidelines. The next steps of this project are to conduct the feasibility assessments and targeted analyses over the next year and into 2019, and to deliver our technical report by the end of fiscal year in March 2020. Thank you.